So here we are this morning in the Irish Hall. We need that little bit of rain, right? By way of accompaniment. Makes a lot of sense. Seems like each of our Underhill lectures has been dotted that way. Anathea Portier-Young is professor of Old Testament at Duke Divinity School. Her research focuses on prophetic literature, apocalypticism, early Jewish thought, embodiment, violence and nonviolence, and the pursuit of justice. She also teaches and writes in the area of Christian preaching and is a well-known contributor to workingpreacher.org. Anathea holds degrees from Yale University, the Jesuit School of Theology, Graduate Theological Union, and Duke University. Her most recent book is The Prophetic Body, Embodiment and Mediation in Biblical Prophetic Literature, published by Oxford University Press in 2024. Her earlier monograph, Apocalypse Against Empire, Theologies of Resistance in Early Judaism, was awarded the Manfred Lautenschlager Award for Theology. Additionally, she has co-edited with Gregory Sterling the 2018 Fortress Press text, Scripture and Social Justice, Catholic and Ecumenical Essays. This notable teacher-scholar is also a runner, a dancer, a quilter, a gardener, and most significantly, a mom. Reflecting on Thea's many contributions, CSTM Professor of Old Testament Andrew Davis has this to say, and I quote, "Thea's commitment to justice and to human dignity permeates her scholarship, her pastoral writing and preaching, and her volunteer ministries. This kind of integration is a rare find in the Academy. It is a testament to Thea's talent, wisdom, and work ethic, and it stands as a true gift to the Church, the Academy, and the world. Dressing us, presenting, encountering God through sacred art, prophetic text, and bodily experience, here is Anathea Portier-Young."
Very moving. Thank you. Thank you to Dean McCarthy, to the continuing education team, especially Megan De Dios and Cara O'Sullivan. Thank you to Dr. Colleen Griffith. And thanks to each of you for coming out today, for making time to learn and engage with each other on the topic of spirituality, art, scripture, and the body. Mystic, scholar, and novelist Evelyn Underhill maintained that the very same sensory perceptions that enable us to perceive phenomena in this earthly realm can lead us also to perceive God. For Underhill, that power of perception was a key to the Christian spiritual life. Philosopher Helen Fielding similarly views perception as an entry point to encounter. Perception occurs in and through our bodies. We hear, smell, touch, sense vibrations, warmth and coolness, proximities and distances, because we are creatures in bodies. Take a moment to invite awareness of your senses, to see the space around you. What do you hear? Inhale deeply. You smell. And what do you feel in your body as you process and organize, receive these perceptions? What emotions do they stir? Where do you feel those? Now I ask a different set of questions. How do these sense perceptions ground you and orient you in this space where you find yourself? How do they connect you with the people? How might they connect you to God? Fielding argues that one way we cultivate perception and through perception encounter others is by engaging art. Underhill regarded mysticism itself and the spiritual life as a form of art. In her words, the art of arts, their source, and also their end. Art can mediate truths that make sense to the body through the senses that our minds do not have an explanation for. In Fielding's words, art makes visible to us what is invisible to everyday vision. It opens us and alters us, decenters and reorients us. And faced with regimes of terror, falsehood, alienation, art fosters engagement, connection, recognition, and responsibility. The topic of sacred art is broad. It is all around us in this very space. For our discussion today, I focus on a modern illuminated Bible called the St. John's Bible that was commissioned in 1998 by the Benedictine monks of St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. And we will narrow the focus further still by focusing on 3 illuminations from the St. John's Bible Prophets volume, which was completed in 2005. Each of these illuminations foregrounds spatial and bodily mediation of divine encounter. See them here on the slide from left to right. They are Isaiah 6, Isaiah's vision of the divine throne, Ezekiel 1, Ezekiel's vision of the divine chariot, and Isaiah 52, 13 to 53, 12, the poem of the suffering servant or suffering slave. These illuminations invite viewers to see God and the future that God promises, but they do more. They also invite viewers to enter sacred spaces of encounter and there meet God. It is not incidental that these works of art illuminate biblical texts. Text and illumination alike are media, which is to say they mediate. Mediate comes from the Latin mediatus, meaning placed in the middle, which in Latin is medium, middle, medium. Something that is mediate occupies the middle space between 2 parties or objects and has the potential to form a bridge, a link, a connection between them. When we say text and image are media, we mean they are a communicative channel, but also a connecting bridge between writer and audience, speaker and hearer, artist and viewer. The biblical text is a revelatory medium linking humans and God, revealing to us who and what God is and what God desires from us. It also draws us toward God. It furnishes the language of our prayer and worship. Illuminations similarly draw us into an imaginative world that coexists with, supplements, and expands the world our senses construct as reality. Texts, paintings, and graphic art are what Marshall McLuhan called hot media. They demand engagement and imagination. They also facilitate transportation, absorption, immersion, and connection. These media carry with them an ethical demand, and they open onto ethical possibilities. We are not simply observers of the world we encounter in text and art. We are artists too. We are builders. We are moral actors. The sacred spaces and bodies portrayed in the words and images of the St. John's Bible mediate divine encounter. So do the words and the images themselves. Like the texts they illuminate, the three images we will study build a mediating bridge. Their invitation to encounter God extends beyond the moment of reading or viewing. They invite us to encounter God in sacred scripture and sacred space, in liturgy, in creation, through the mediating bodies of angels, prophets, Christ, other humans, and through our own bodily experience. They teach us where to look for God. They will declare to us that God is present not only in the temple, but also in spaces of oppression. They will reveal to us a God on the throne and on the cross. The God who became incarnate will reveal God's self not as passive observer and not simply sovereign, but as one who stands with and among the oppressed. The creative, scholarly, and spiritual possibilities these illuminations present are fundamentally relational, drawing us not only toward God, but also toward creation and one another. Our encounter with God through sacred art and sacred text thus makes a moral claim on us, inviting us into solidarity with one another and with creation, and making us partners in God's own work of justice. I've stated that word and image, prophet and place, each play a role in mediating our encounter with God. But why is mediation necessary? We worship a God who is transcendent, holy, and wholly other, where we are small, finite, sinful, and mortal. This God is great, omnipotent, perfect, and eternal. God in heaven is obscured from view by cloud and distance, seated on a throne of glory, surrounded by a host of ministering angels while we are, here on earth. And yet, this God chooses us, chooses relationship. The scriptures testify to God's repeated and enduring choice and promise to be with humanity. God walked in the garden and searched for the people God had made. God dined with Abram and Sarai. God became incarnate in the person of Jesus, choosing both to dwell among us and to be one of us, fully divine and fully human. Absent these moments when, according to our scriptures and our creedal confessions, God walked on earth among us, how and where do we encounter God? You could begin to answer these questions from your own experience and your formation: prayer, liturgy, holy places, sacraments, community, human relationships, nature. Common to these ways of encountering God is that they are not direct. They are mediated. In the Old Testament, direct encounter with God is the exception, as in our own experience. So in the Old Testament, mediation and distance are the norm. Four main types of mediators facilitated an encounter with God in the Old Testament scriptures. Angels were portrayed with the power to move between heavenly and earthly realms and could act and speak for God on earth. Priests and Levites mediated through temple liturgy, including sacrifice, sacred meals, and psalms. Judges and kings were meant to mediate divine deliverance, justice, and provision. And prophets were called to mediate divine will and word, divine longing and summons, judgment and consolation, even divine healing and resurrecting power. It was not just people who mediated the divine. Sacred spaces and objects also mediated divine power and presence. During Israel's wilderness wandering, the tabernacle or tent of meeting traveled with the people. God would descend to meet them there and be present in their midst. Within the tent was the Ark of the Covenant, the efficacious symbol of divine presence and power that also testified to the mutual commitment of God and people. And this space was fundamentally about relationship. The ark was also understood to be God's throne, and we'll see how this is in the art that we look at. It was a locus of divine power, a place where God sat, a word that in Hebrew also means to dwell, to live among, to reside. Ark's covering was called the mercy seat, a name that highlighted the function of this holy ark and this holy throne in mediating divine presence and power and in repairing ruptures in the relationship between God, Israel, and the rest of creation. The ark throne crossed with the Israelites into the land of promise, and according to biblical narrative, David brought it to Jerusalem, where his son Solomon built a temple that would house the ark in a more permanent fixed dwelling. And this divine throne furnished the central axis and point of orientation for Israel's relationship with God. Here God would dwell and rule in the people's midst, and here the people would encounter God in worship. This space of worship and the throne it contains are centerpiece and frame for the illuminations we now turn to. In front of the throne, and between the throne and the cross, we will find the mediating body also of the prophet. The first illumination we consider is Isaiah's vision of God seated on a throne in the Jerusalem temple, recorded in Isaiah 6. The vision takes place around 739 BCE and is part of his commissioning as a prophet. Isaiah uses first-person language, vivid sensory imagery, and rich detail to narrate his encounter with God. These vivid details make it possible for audiences to imagine, recreate, and participate in that encounter. The temple setting of the vision evokes this history of relationship and worship, the memory of earlier encounters, the promise of future ones. Artist Donald Jackson's rendering locates the viewer in this sacred space and invites the viewer to identify with the prophet and encounter God with him. We'll focus first on the text and then the illumination to better understand the mediating function of each. Isaiah reports, "I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne with the train of his garment filling the temple." Isaiah's seeing provides a template for reader and hearer to envision God. God's position and posture evokes authority, stability, and sovereignty. God's vastness creates an impression of contrasting human smallness, amplifying awareness of human contingency and finitude. Contrasting with the stationary deity are winged seraphim, who embody paradox and liminality. The account describes them this way. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they hovered. One cried out to the other, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. All the earth is filled with God's glory." And at the sound of that cry, the frame of the door shook, and the house was filled with smoke. The seraphim are guardians and mediators of sacred power who protect and open the boundary between human and divine realms. God and prophet here meet at that threshold. A multitude of sensory details marks the transformation of the temple into a liminal border space where divine reality breaks into human reality in a form that is visible, audible, tangible, and breathable. And with that inbreaking, the very boundary shifts, temporarily allowing Isaiah to witness heavenly worship and to interact bodily with other participants in the scene. The smoke that fills the sanctuary is a hallmark of theophany, a manifestation of God, that together with quaking frequently accompanies God's descent from heaven. Sound, shaking, and smoke are part of an interactive, cooperative liturgy in which the very architecture responds to God's existence and presence. The Seraphim's song calls attention to God's absolute otherness and the great extent of God's glory. This glory connotes a perceptible, even physical, manifestation of God's divine being. And in response to these sensory stimuli, Isaiah declares, "Woe to me, I am lost, for I am a man of impure lips, and I live among a people of impure lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Isaiah expresses the contradiction between his sight and his speech. One embodies a mortal state of impurity, the other allows him to perceive God. Transformative touch engages yet another sense and resolves the contradiction, making it possible for the mortal prophet to speak and act on God's behalf. A seraph grasps tongs, picks up a glowing coal from the altar, and touching the prophet's mouth, declares, "Because this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed, and your sin will be atoned." And now Isaiah hears another voice, God's, requesting a candidate for mission. Isaiah immediately volunteers, and in response, receives his mandate. But his charge is a complex one. It emphasizes the interdependence of sensory perception, cognition, and decision-making. Eye, ear, and heart together facilitate encounter and relationship, and the people must be able to see and hear and judge in order to understand what God desires from them. Once they understand, Isaiah is told, they will turn and be healed. But consistent with the prophet's painful experience of atonement and purification, Isaiah's commission defers that bodily healing and that social healing until a period after desolation and even the people's expulsion from the land. But at that later time, the passage's vividly immersive sensory detail will facilitate the audience's transport back to this moment in the temple before the throne of glory, and will help mediate their own atoning and healing transformation. And it is at such a moment that Donald Jackson's illumination invites viewers to enter the vision. Its three archways form a triptych, an artistic composition with a central panel and two wings. Unlike a classic triptych, where the three panels are equal in height, the wings of this triptych are truncated, giving the painting the shape of a winged figure resembling an angel. This composition emphasizes the mediating power of sacred space and sacred image. The wings open onto the viewer, turning temple architecture inside out, allowing the viewer to experience a sacred space, the Holy of Holies, that ordinary worshipers would not otherwise be able to enter. This unfolding and opening of temple architecture is matched by the painting's softened edges and porous boundaries. In Isaiah's vision, the hem of the Lord's robe fills the temple. In Jackson's painting, the color purple, traditionally associated with royal robes, suffuses each corner. It also exceeds the frame as bold purple brushstrokes break through architectural boundaries. And at the lower edges of the painting, the purple find its complement. It's a little hard to see here, but with a deep blue-green, colors of earth and sea. The purple that symbolizes divine sovereignty and glory does not abut that terrestrial blue-green. They bleed together, hinting at the possibility of transformation and sanctification of the earthly realm through divine encounter. And just as Isaiah's narration used sensory detail, movement, and spatial orientation to facilitate the audience's transportation into the vision, so too does Jackson's painting. 10 lampstands emit flame and smoke. Cloud-like golden brushstrokes dapple the throne in the painting's upper center. The repeated motif of curved wings are stamped in black and gold across the surface of the painting, creating a dizzying sense of movement that only stills at the painting's center. This still center forms the axis and focal point of the painting. It positions the viewer to encounter the deity who looks out from the lofty throne. You'll see 4 rectangular shapes stacked in the central panel. At the top, a golden square forms the back of God's throne. Throughout the St. John's Bible, and drawing on symbolism from the iconographic tradition, gold leaf symbolizes divine presence. Echoing rows of golden squares at the bottom of each wing of the triptych emphasize that while divine presence is concentrated in the throne, it is not limited to this one place. Framed within this upper golden square, as though looking out from a window, is the silhouetted figure of God's head and shoulders, with the suggestion of arms outstretched as though resting on the arms of a chair. And again, it's a little difficult to see, but very small on either side of that golden back of the throne. Prismatic brickwork frames the throne. This echo of the rainbow after the flood expands the visual vocabulary of divine presence to convey the promise of divine covenant commitment by reassembling the rainbow motif into a form reminiscent of the stained glass windows commonly found in Christian churches and cathedrals. The artist subtly links the sacred scene of Isaiah's encounter to the sacred spaces of Christian worship. God's silhouette visually sits atop and merges into a dark, elongated rectangle. The throne is only partly perceptible as such. In the book of Leviticus, God declares, "I appear in the cloud on the mercy seat." Here, broad brushstrokes and stippling create a diffuse golden cloud that obscures much of the divine form. The cloud emphasizes God's transcendence, this gulf between God and humanity, and the need for a mediator. Below this dark rectangle and occupying the painting's foreground is another golden square. The golden stamped wings on either side suggest that this golden square is the mercy seat, the cover for the Ark of the Covenant, which according to Exodus 25 was overlaid with gold and flanked by cherubim. While these 3 rectangles are stacked one atop the other, negative space separates them from the 4th rectangle, within which is supported the naked figure of the prophet Isaiah. Bridging this space is the prophet's body. Isaiah's arm reaches across the gulf to grasp the mercy seat. The prophet's arm forms a vertical line at the painting's central axis, and that line terminates in the silhouetted figure of the deity. This connection between prophet and God is not direct, but is itself mediated through the mercy seat, through ark and throne, and through the sacred space that makes possible the encounter between God and human. This mediating body of the prophet occupies the foreground. Thrown off balance by the shaking of the temple thresholds, His posture is both active and passive. The prophet touches and is touched, loses and finds footing. Seraph wings support and cradle the prophet's body and head, while the prophet grips the mercy seat like an anchor or like a person claiming sanctuary at the altar. Rich purple tones convey that at this moment of purification, the prophet's body is suffused with divine glory. Yet where God is distant and obscured, the prophet is near and visible. The prophet's nakedness emphasizes visibility and accessibility, while detailed rendering of hand and foot emphasize capacity for action and movement on behalf of God and people alike. The absence of facial features suggests that the figure of the prophet also represents humanity. The viewer is invited to identify with this mediating figure, to be purified with him, and to answer the summons as he has done. Here am I, send me. That is, in facilitating an identification between prophet and viewer, the illumination commissions the viewer to be mediator too. Now, I mentioned earlier that the ark was flanked and guarded by cherubim, or in Hebrew, keruvim. Not, in fact, these cheerful little babies, but something more like this frightening apparition, rendered by graphic artist Isis Sangare. Keruvim, or cherubim, were massive winged creatures whose bodies resembled both human and lion. That is, like the seraphim, their very bodily form is a mediation. It touches and enfolds what is human, but it unites it to what is wild and powerful and beyond our capacity to tame and order. In so doing, it symbolically bridges between the human realm and the realm of the holy other, namely God. Scholars understood cherubim to be a class of angel, a mediating being that occupied and protected the boundary between profane and sacred space. And according to numerous biblical passages, the cherubim and ark together formed God's throne, similar to the thrones of ancient kings, as shown on the slide. Numerous biblical prayers describe God as seated above the cherubim. Now, for the prophet Ezekiel, these winged cherubim were not molten statues, they were living creatures. And they had a further function corresponding to the steeds that drew the royal divine chariot. That is, for Ezekiel, God's throne, the ark, and the mercy seat were not fixed in one place. They were mobile. Ezekiel lived and wrote in the 6th century BCE, in a time of unprecedented national crisis. Ezekiel was part of a community of Judeans whom invading Babylonian armies had taken captive and forcibly deported to Babylon in 597 BCE. 10 years after their deportation, the Babylonians subdued Judea completely, destroying the Jerusalem temple, ending the Davidic monarchy, burning the city of Jerusalem, and taking yet another group of Judeans captive into Babylon. Ezekiel's chariot vision occurred in between these two events. God burdened him with the task of declaring to the exiled community that they would not return home anytime soon. Jerusalem and its temple would be destroyed, and later in the book, Ezekiel would witness the glory of the Lord rising from the temple and departing from it. But the destruction of the temple and the Lord's departure from it did not mean that the Lord abandoned God's people or that they would be deprived of God's presence and mercy. Before the temple had been built, remember, the tabernacle was a mobile sanctuary. The ark throne it housed traveled with the people through the wilderness, and God met them and led them in every place where they traveled. Jerusalem's destruction did not mean God had unchosen the people or abandoned their covenant. God remained committed to them. and remained present with them. The mobile chariot throne asserted, moreover, that even in the face of conquering empires, God remains sovereign, not just in Judea, but throughout the cosmos. Now, the illumination of Ezekiel's chariot vision primarily occupies the upper third of the page, but it spills into the margins, revealing legs and feet of the cherubim between columns of text and portraying the movement of the ophanim, the wheels within wheels, ringed with eyes that together with the cherubim make possible the chariot's movement. The wheels range across the perimeter of both pages, mediating the prophet's encounter with the deity, but also mediating divine presence, sovereignty, providence, and encounter in every direction. The illumination of Ezekiel's throne vision shares features with Isaiah's. Notice that God is again silhouetted within a golden square, ringed in rainbow, portraying the divine throne above the cherubim, a larger golden rectangle below the throne. See, it's most of the frame now. Again, represents the mercy seat, while wing stamps visually echo the mediating angelic figures and dynamism of Isaiah's vision. Yet there are important differences. The throne and silhouetted divine figure are smaller. They are no longer forming the central axis. Instead, the throne is distant and left of center, receding from view and on the move. The cherubim, meanwhile, were only hinted at in Isaiah's vision. Here, they occupy the foreground and command the viewer's attention. And again, by contrast with Isaiah's vision, the prophet is not at all in the foreground and not represented on this page. He occupies the margin of the following page, where he swallows the scroll of sorrow that issues from the throne. His back is to the viewer, and he too is smaller, creating distance and now disinviting identification between viewer and prophet. Rather than focus on the person of the prophet, Ezekiel's chariot vision functions like a vortex, sucking attention back to the cherubim who crowd together above the mercy seat. These cherubim fill the space between the viewer and God. They stand in the way of direct encounter. Donald Jackson based his portrayal of the cherubim's humanoid faces and rounded bodies on clay coffins from ancient Canaan, such as these. Ezekiel refers to the cherubim as living beings, but Jackson's interpretation also portrays them as angels of death. Their somber, plaintive expressions convey worry, warning, and concern. The path forward for God's people lies through destruction and death. Similar to the Buddhist practice of corpse meditation, viewers contemplating these cherubim confront uncomfortable realities of impermanence and mortality, contingency, finitude, endings. But there is also cause for hope. Behind the dark forms of the cherubim gleams the mercy seat. On the other side of destruction lies the possibility of atonement and reconciliation. Its form is solid. It is both ground and frame. At the edges of the frame, rainbow offers glimmers of promise, assurance of God's ongoing commitment to the covenant people, and of the possibility that after destruction, the world may begin. The third and final image we consider today is the suffering servant or slave of Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12. The anonymous prophet who wrote this poem lived during the period of Judean exile in Babylon in the latter half of the 6th century BCE. The poem describes an enslaved person whose innocent suffering has redeemed the people and atoned for their sins. Like a lamb led silently to slaughter, writes the poet-prophet, he was wounded for our transgressions. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his wounds we are healed. The slave who bore the sins of others would be exalted and lifted up. The poem does not name the slave. Different clues within the text of Isaiah support identifying the slave with the prophet, a different member of the exilic community, the entire exiled community, or the people of Israel as a whole. Christian interpreters would later view this poem as a prophecy of Christ's suffering and atoning self-sacrifice. Possibly alluding to Isaiah's poem, the hymn in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 to 11 declares that Jesus took the form of a slave in the incarnation and humbled himself, becoming obedient to the point of death on a cross, and God therefore exalted him. Christian liturgy declares that Jesus is the Paschal Lamb who takes away the sin of the world. In light of these resonances, Christian interpreters have long identified the suffering servant as Jesus Christ. Jackson's illumination does not reject this interpretation, but it goes several steps further. The central axis and focal point of this illumination is an inky cross. But this cross is not made of solid beams, and it is not Jesus whose form occupies its center. The cross's vertical beam is open, not a throne, but a gateway or a passage. Modeled on the door of no return at the colonial slave fort Elmina Castle in Ghana, the gateway at the Illumination Center witnesses to the abduction and enslavement of more than 10 million Africans who were forced through gates such as this one before being loaded onto ships and transported across the Atlantic. The naked and emaciated child who stands in the gateway embodies a further form of innocent suffering in the malnutrition that compromises the health and future of tens of millions of children in Africa to this day. A chaotic web of chain link fencing inked across the entire surface of the illumination links the cross and Elmina Gate to modern-day prisons and detention centers. The chain links were drawn from photographs of the Guantanamo Bay detention camp, widely condemned for abuses of human rights, including indefinite detention for prisoners without trial or due process. These portrayals of the Middle Passage, hunger crisis, and Guantanamo Bay are not simply a visual catalog of misfortune. They highlight the reality of structural and systemic evils and corporate sins. They seek communal confession, repentance, and justice. They demand witness and engagement. As in Ezekiel's chariot vision, here the viewer confronts realities of suffering and death. But like that image, this illumination does not leave the viewer bereft of hope. The rainbow motif that has ringed the divine throne now shimmers into view behind blood-red streaks. The solid square of the mercy seat has reformed into a golden cross, fashioned from prison bars and woven with the darkness. Jesus' death and resurrection was not an exit from the suffering of this world, but an ongoing commitment in the face of it. This final image declares that God does not only meet us in the sanctuary, nor did God condescend once and then abandon us. God chose to be present in the exile, on the cross, in the hold of the ship, on the auction block, and in the prison cell. God is the Lamb. God is also the hungry and naked child. Our engagement with sacred art and prophetic text facilitates our encounter with God in several ways. It attunes our senses to the sacred. It decenters us and opens us to the otherness and nearness of God. It invites us to experience holy visions and answer prophetic summons. And it helps us to recognize God's presence in a host of holy others. And of course, it is not only by viewing and contemplating art that we encounter God, nor is it only in reading scripture, nor in the ostensibly passive experience of sensory perception. It is also in making art, in dancing, music, writing, interacting with one another, active engagement with the world Artist and theologian Makoto Fujimura holds that it is in our acts of making that we come to imitate God, the Creator, and know the depth of God's being and God's grace permeating our lives and God's creation. He develops this principle into a mandate, and here I quote, "Unless there is tangible, fruitful reality that is made into the world, what we know and what we preach has not incarnated itself fully into love." I return to the Elmina Gate, to detention centers and prisons, to our communities. In spaces of suffering, oppression, confusion, and fear, God continues to ask, "Who will go for us, and whom shall I send?" Sacred art, prophetic scriptures, and bodily experience each mediate to us this divine encounter and summons. With Ezekiel, we confront realities of death and destruction. In the face of them, may we also have the courage to incarnate into love, the calling and gift with which we are endowed. And may we respond with Isaiah, "Here I am, send me." Thank you.
Well, mine is a very simple question. I love footnotes, and the wonderful description that you gave of the paintings. Has the artist himself written about the paintings?
Yeah, the artist has given interviews that have been recorded, and there are a few scholars. Susan Sink is one scholar who has published some sort of basic notes based on those interviews. And also Michael Patella, who some here may know or know of his work as a New Testament scholar. He's one of the monks at St. John's Abbey and was part of the exegetical team. So this is something I'll also describe after this specific answer. But he was part of the exegetical team that helped inform the work of the artistic team, and he has also published. So where I share details like the chain link fence or the Elmina Gate or certain symbolism that unless it was kind of me interpreting to you visually, if it was a specific kind of intention detail, that came from those sources. Yeah, and to back up, and what I alluded to just now, something really unique about the St. John's Bible is that, so I mentioned that it was commissioned by the monks at St. John's Abbey, a team of exegetes and theologians from St. John's and their sister college in Collegeville selected the passages that would receive what they called special treatment for those large illuminations, and developed exegetical briefs on those passages and sent it to Donald Jackson, was the lead artist. He also had a team of artists that he worked with, and the artists would make sort of drafts of and send their ideas in terms of how they wanted to illuminate that passage, and they would go back and forth. And so there was a lot of intentionality, a lot of collaboration and brainstorming and sharing of ideas, how best to convey the interpretations and in effect the kind of theological claims that they saw emerging out of the texts themselves and how to represent that artistically.
Thank you. Fascinating.
Thank you. One up here, I believe, as well.
Yeah, hi. What you just described, is that practice being done by lay people? Like, I'm thinking it's such a great, I'm a minister, it's such a great practice to invite people into. Do you know has that become like a common practice in churches or temples or anything? This idea of doing Bible study by asking people to create art?
That's a great question. I know I've done that, and I know others who have done those kinds of kind of workshops and prayer retreat activities through creating art. So I don't know if I could point to particular particular like major figures associated with that, where you could like go read more about how they organize and structure that. But that's only because I haven't formally looked into that, or informally. But yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Dean McCarthy.
Thank you, Thea, for a wonderful lecture in every way. It was such a delight. One of the things that I've always noticed about a lecture when people are explaining the illuminations of the St. John Collegeville Bible is just how much pleasure there is in coming to understand something, right? So even when you were pointing out certain things, I could hear the audience say, "Oh." And so my question is to what extent does that inform your understanding of mediation, right? That the process itself of coming to understand something, whether it is coming to understand a particular image, or coming to understand text of Scripture itself, the process is an important part of what theologically we might call revelation. And I'm just wondering if you have any comments on the connection between mediation and the process of coming to understand these materials.
Yeah, well, I think this goes back also to where I began in the lecture with Helen Fielding's work. So Fielding is a philosopher who is specifically interested in the ethical dimensions of engaging with art. And it's that word engaging that I think is very much overlapping with the language you're using of process, right? That taking the time and investing our attention and scrutinizing and opening ourselves both to try to better understand what we're looking at, right? Even if we don't necessarily land on the intention of the artist, because we may not have access to that always, but we are, as you say, kind of processing what we're seeing. That process is the commitment. That process is part of entering into relationality, and it forms us for ethical engagement. And so, that part of what I want to urge in each of you is even, I'll give an example from a different medium, is poetry. I tend to shy away from poetry because it's a very demanding medium, right? But every now and then, I'll make a commitment, and I'll really sit with a poem, and it's going to cognitively require so much more from me than even reading a scholarly monograph. I think reading a poem is harder than reading a scholarly monograph, but I'm growing by making that commitment and exploring all, with a poem, it's all the open-endedness, and you have to make decisions. You have to try out meanings that you're not sure of and see where they go, right? It's the engagement that opens us up.
Thank you. One more here.
Is this on? I have a question that your lecture triggered in me, and it builds on the Dean's question, which is the process of mediation and mediators. Because historically, there have been moments of expansion and restriction. So I was thinking about the Protestant Reformation, where the spiritual leaders became stigmatized, which then stigmatized art, right? So they're taking all of the art and the iconography out of churches, and then you think about there are moments when people are trying to control the interpretation and the engagement process by what is allowed to be expressed or seen as a mediator and what is taken away. And so I wondered how your historical interpretation helps us understand when we can expand and engage in this process, and when it's more restricted. Do you see patterns? Do you see promises, opportunities, threats? Sorry, that's a very big picture question.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And for example, as a biblical scholar, right, it was in the 20th century that various papal encyclicals and conciliar documents really charged scholars with doing the kind of critical exegesis, right, that had previously been looked at as something, uncomfortable and not helpful, right? So we've seen those ebbs and flows, tightening and expanding within the Catholic tradition, even with regard to sacred text. For example, I view my role as a professor as one of empowerment and fostering agency in my students as interpreters and, as you might guess, as moral actors, right? I think that will go hand in hand, and also formation is critically important, right? So if you want to invite that kind of agency to be an interpreter, engage with text, engage with art, pair that with strong formation and critical faculties, right? I think that's a really important piece of it. But I think in moments when that tightening is happening culturally, the arts are often a place where resistance happens, right? It's an incredible site of expression and a way of reaching people, right? Even when there's a kind of control and policing over those modes of expression being asserted. It has a way of breaking through.
I think was there a hand up over in that corner that I missed? No. Okay, thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much for just a wonderful, stellar presentation and this beautiful, moving images you've shared with us this morning. So I know very little about the things you've spoken about, but I have learned much already in an hour, so thank you. So my question is this. I'm very drawn to some of the things that you brought our attention to in the images regarding what you're calling the mercy seat. I would not have known any of that at all. And as you laid it out and pointed these to us, and especially with reference to the historical Judea being attacked by the Babylonians, and that Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians and the temple there. And you said, but the tabernacle and ark are movable and traveled with the people, so God has not abandoned them. And when you were talking about that, what flitted through my memory bank, and my memory bank is kind of caffeine deprived this morning, was when I was younger and finally got to visit Rome and the Vatican, and making my way, and I got into the Holy of Holies of Sistine Chapel. I was amazed and shocked that the central point that I saw was an empty seat, the empty throne seat, right? That is hanging above. And I wondered if there's any connection you could unpack for a little bit between the things you've said about the mercy seat in these images and what that meant to the peoples of Jerusalem and the movability of the tabernacle and ark and house and what we find now in the Vatican and that empty throne.
Thank you.
Excellent question, and I will not. I have seen what you have seen, but I will not pretend to be a necessarily accurate interpreter of the intent in that space. But what I can say, one, I can share a little bit about what place the ark and the mercy seat and this Holy of Holies played in the liturgical calendar of the Jewish people, as particularly as laid out in the book of Leviticus, and how that relates to Christian liturgy, and specifically the Mass today. So Leviticus 16 provides the instructions for the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur in Hebrew, and that is the one day of the year. I mentioned that Isaiah 6 image kind of turns that space inside out and makes it accessible, but it's the one day of the year that the high priest would be permitted to enter into the Holy of Holies. and through a set of sacrificial practices on that day and after various rites of preparation and purification, would perform an atoning rite for the people as a whole. He would also atone for himself first, but an atoning rite for the people as a whole. That is the liturgical high point of the Jewish calendar, right? And in the Mass, right, that atoning sacrificial offering is typologically and theologically identified with the atoning self-sacrifice of Jesus as commemorated and represented, made present again in the Mass. And so my guess would be there may well be some very deliberate, what we would think of as a kind of architectural typology in which there's an acknowledgement that what is narrated and described and prescribed in the Old Testament for Christians may be understood to prefigure something that is present in the New, and especially made present in the person and life and death and resurrection of Jesus. So I hope that helps give some point of connection. Yeah.
I think that's all we're going to have time for this morning, but I think we all would agree that you have stimulated us not only at the level of our cognition, but deeply at the level of affect, and we're very grateful for your presence with us, Theo. Thank you.